Lesson 5, Sigmund Freud, a bunch of short lessons on him. One of the most famous things that Freud was known for was developing one of the first to develop a theory of personality, like how we what explains why we act the way they do, why we talk a lot, why some of us are more controlling than others, why some of us are energetic and crazy and nut jobs, and some of us are very calm and maybe more passive, and some of us are much more detail oriented, some of us are sloppy joes. So like anyway, Freud wanted to come up with some theory about that, so he comes up with a personality theory. It's still talked about today some, but it's not like super amazing in terms of explaining behavior today, but it is very famous in psychology. And it was called the tripartite theory of personality. Tripartite. Now, you look at it, you got like tri at the start of it. So that means like three. So it has three parts. Okay. That's easy to remember. Tripartite theory of personality. What you need to remember is that it's Freud. And then you need to know what each three part means because it's very, very famous. The three parts are called the id, the ego, and the superego. And the relationship between the id, the ego, and the superego, that ends up explaining behavior in someone. If someone's driven by one more than the other, then that explains their personality according to Freud. Now, if you look at the little picture above me here, check that out. It's again the iceberg, which we're going to draw. We'll do that as part of the lesson, not necessarily right now, but in another lesson. And you're going to draw this, and you're going to draw an iceberg. All right. And then you're going to have consciousness, subconsciousness, or preconsciousness, as Freud called it as well. And then the unconscious deep down in the ocean. And then look at how this works. You have this thing called the superego that works at the conscious, preconscious, and the unconscious level. You have the ego, which works at the consciousness level and subconscious, and then the id, buried deep inside the recesses of our soul. We have the id working. So we're going to find out what each of these is, and then define them, and then you need to know them really well. Okay, so here we go. So there's that chart. I just showed it to you. Let's find out what they are. All right, so first off, let's start with the id. The id is part of the personality, Freud theorized, that operates at the unconscious level. Unconscious, and it's based on a pleasure principle. Pleasure, it's the part of us that wants to have fun, that wants to do things that bring us enjoyment. It's the part of us that wants instant gratification. I want it, and I want it now. When children are really young, think of like a 2 or 3 year olds, like they're almost entirely driven by the id, according to Freud. They want it, and they want it now. They want candy, they want to watch TV, they don't want to go to bed. And so as you get older, hopefully, as you get older, your id becomes under control. If not, and there definitely are adults that are driven by their id, you will make a flipping mess of your life if you are driven all the time by just whatever feels good and I want gratification right now. Like you will have a flipping mess of a life. Just some little life experience, little life suggestion right there. All right, so we have the id pleasure, the pleasure principle, and it's deep inside, like it just drives us. And frankly, we as we grow older, we try to control it, because sometimes like we have to go to work, we can't just do pleasure. Sometimes we have to like cook a meal rather than just doing something pleasurable. So we have responsibilities rather than just gratification. All right, here's an example of what the id is. Okay, so explains it. It's like a little story. So, for example, if your id walked past a stranger eating an ice cream, it would most likely take the ice cream for itself. It doesn't know or care that it's rude to take something belonging to someone else. It would only care that you wanted the ice cream. See, doesn't that sound like a 2 year old? All right, that's like that. Mental processing of the id is like a 2 year old. I want it. I want it now. I don't understand that it's somebody else's. Thanks. All right, that's the id. All right, second part is the superego. Now remember, the superego works at a conscious, sub, and unconscious level, according to Freud. It's concerned with social ethics. So the superego is like the reasoning part. It's your kind of your morals. It knows what's right. It's hopefully you have a active superego, so that way you're not rude and just take someone else's ice cream. It's your moral compass. It says what's your right and what is wrong. So let's look at how the story works with that. It's your moral compass. Superego. It develops as a child learns what their culture considers right and wrong. If your super ego, notice it focuses on culture because it might be different in different cultures. If your super ego walked past the same stranger with the ice cream, it would not take their ice cream because it would know that that would be rude. However, if both your id and your super ego were involved and your id was strong enough to override your super ego's concern, you would still take the ice cream. But afterward, you would most likely feel guilt and shame over your actions. So the super ego is the thing that makes us feel bad when we do something wrong, and then we're like, I knew that was wrong, but I did it anyway. Yeah, that's because your id, your instant gratification, was stronger than your super ego. All right, that according to Freud again. All right, cool. Super ego, got it. Let's go to the next one. Ego. Now the ego is again is kind of another reasoning part of your brain. So we have the id, which is the pleasure. We have the super ego, which is like your moral compass, which knows right and wrong, and then the ego is the thing that wants to satisfy the id. Okay, like your ego's like, hey, you know what? I want some pleasure, but I want to do it in a safe and rational way. So the ego is going to try to balance out the id and the super ego by getting what you want, but by doing it in a way that's rational and okay. So there's a balance between the id and the super ego. That's the ego. Remember, ego is the balance between the id and the super ego. And so it'll say, like, you know what? I want ice cream, but I probably should go get a job, earn some money, and then I can go buy it rather than steal it. That'd be good. All right, cool. So if you walk past a stranger with the ice cream one more time, your ego would mediate, okay, like negotiate, if you will, the conflict between your id, I want the ice cream now, and the super ego, it's wrong to take someone else's ice cream, and decide to go buy your own ice cream. While this may mean you have to wait 10 more minutes, which would frustrate your ego decides to make that sacrifice as part of the compromise, satisfying your desire for ice cream, that's your id, while also avoiding an unpleasant social situation and potential feelings of shame and guilt, which is your super ego. So how strong your id, ego, and super ego are what determines like personality and why you're driven certain ways. Now we're going to look at personality theory in a later unit, but right now just know that like this is Freud's theory of personality. All right, and you're going to have to know this really well. We're going to draw it. We'll do that in the next lesson.